let's return to the travails of Ken Clarke, the Justice Secretary, whose face calls for his resignation today after appearing to suggest some rapes are more serious than others. Joining us now is the Labour MP Bridget Phillipson. She managed a women's refuge before entering Parliament. And I'm wondering now whether at the end of the day, in which he's tried to clarify his remarks, you accept that Ken Clarke does view all rape as serious.
Well, he's gone some way to making
Phillipson's legal nightmare when education policy goes horribly wrong. Right. Before we dive into this absolute car crash of governmental overreach, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything about how our education system operates behind closed doors. Trust me, you'll want to stay tuned for more explosive political revelations like this one. Now then, picture this. You're Bridget Phillipson, Labour's Education Secretary, riding high on your party's electoral victory, perhaps eyeing up Angela Rayner's deputy leadership position, when suddenly the High Court delivers a judicial slap so severe it could be heard from Westminster to Oxford. That's precisely what happened when Justice Naomi Olembogen ruled that Phillipson's heavy-handed shutdown of Oxford Business College was not just misguided, but downright unlawful. And now, she's facing a multi-million-pound lawsuit that could make the post office scandal look like a minor accounting error. But here's where it gets deliciously ironic. This is the same education secretary who's been preaching about standards, accountability, and proper process while simultaneously trampling all over due process herself. The sheer audacity is breathtaking. Really. Phillipson didn't just stumble into this legal quagmire. She sprinted headfirst into it with all the grace of bull in a china shop, armed with nothing but righteous indignation and a Sunday Times investigation that, whilst raising legitimate concerns, apparently wasn't quite the smoking gun she thought it was. Let me paint you the complete picture of this governmental omnishambles. Back in March, the Sunday Times dropped what seemed like a bombshell investigation alleging that hundreds of students at Oxford Business College had fraudulently claimed over £4 million from the student loan company across 2 years. The allegations were serious. Students allegedly accessing loans with no intention of studying, with particular focus on Romanian nationals being encouraged to enroll at franchise universities. On the surface, it looked damning enough to warrant immediate action. But here's where Phillipson's story begins to unravel faster than a cheap jumper. Rather than conducting a thorough, measured investigation that would stand up to legal scrutiny, Phillipson went full Thatcher on the college. She blocked Oxford Business College from receiving student loan funding with immediate effect in April, essentially delivering a financial death sentence without proper trial. She declared that it was clear to me that the management of recruitment and attendance at the college has fallen well short, a statement that now reads like the educational equivalent of let them eat cake given the High Court's subsequent ruling. The Department for Education launched what they call an investigation, but what Justice Olembogen would later describe as Kafkaesque, a term that should send shivers down the spine of anyone who believes in British justice and fair play. Franz Kafka would have been proud of this bureaucratic nightmare, a process so convoluted, so deliberately obtuse, that the accused couldn't even properly defend themselves. Oxford Business College wasn't provided with complete evidence to support the allegations during the DFE's investigation, effectively being asked to respond to charges they couldn't fully understand. It's like being asked to solve a crossword puzzle whilst blindfolded and having half the clues withheld. Now, Padmesh Gupta, the college's managing director, wasn't having any of this governmental heavy-handedness. His response was measured but pointed. A cornerstone of any fair process is a right to know the case against you and to be provided with the evidence that supports that case. Revolutionary concept, isn't it? The idea that British institutions should actually follow British principles of justice. Who would have thought? But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The timing couldn't be worse for Phillipson personally. She's currently in the running to replace Angela Rayner as Labour's deputy leader, positioning herself as a leadership's preferred candidate against Lucy Powell, who enjoys support from the party's left wing. Lord Blunkett has thrown his considerable weight behind Phillipson, claiming she would keep the party united. Rather ironic, considering she's currently presiding over a legal catastrophe that's anything but unifying. This isn't Phillipson's first dance with the courts either. Since the election, she's managed to rack up 3 High Court battles. That's quite an achievement for someone who's supposed to be bringing stability to education policy. Her VAT raid on private schools and controversial free speech policies have already landed her in hot water, and now this Oxford Business College debacle threatens to define her tenure for all the wrong reasons. The High Court ruling exposes something rather uncomfortable about how our government operates when it thinks it's in the right. Justice Bojan didn't just rule against Phillipson. She eviscerated the entire process as unlawful. The judge agreed with Oxford Business College's lawyers that the DFE's investigation was fundamentally flawed from the outset. When a High Court judge uses terms like Kafkaesque to describe your departmental procedures, you know you've spectacularly missed the mark. What's particularly galling is that the court case didn't even examine the actual allegations of student loan fraud. It was purely focused on whether Phillipson and the Department for Education followed proper procedure in their response. And they failed that basic test miserably. It's rather like a police investigation being thrown out not because the suspect was innocent, but because the police couldn't be bothered to follow proper procedure. The incompetence is staggering. Oxford Business College is now seeking substantial damages for what they describe as tens of millions of pounds in losses. Their current students were transferred to other universities, their ability to recruit new students was blocked, and their reputation has been dragged through the mud by what the High Court has now ruled was an unlawful process. Gupta's statement that the college's reputation and financial standing have been severely damaged by the Secretary of State's actions and associated public statements now carries the full weight of judicial backing. The broader implications here are genuinely concerning for anyone who cares about how our country is governed. If an education secretary can essentially shut down an educational institution based on newspaper allegations without following proper legal process, what does that say about the rule of law in modern Britain? This isn't about whether Oxford Business College was guilty of the allegations. That's a separate matter entirely. This is about whether our government officials believe they are above the basic principles of British justice. Phillipson's approach reveals a troubling pattern of governance by headline rather than proper procedure. The Sunday Times investigation may well have raised legitimate concerns that deserved investigation, but jumping straight to what amounts to a corporate execution without due process is a kind of authoritarian overreach we'd expect to criticize in other countries. The fact that a High Court judge felt compelled to use such strong language in her ruling suggests this wasn't a minor procedural oversight, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how justice works in a democratic society. What makes this even more politically toxic for Labour is the timing. Here's a party that came to power promising competent governance after years of conservative chaos. Yet their education secretary is racking up unlawful decisions faster than Boris Johnson collected lockdown fines. It's exactly the kind of unforced error that oppositions dream of, and governing parties have nightmares about. The irony is delicious when you consider that Phillipson has been pushing through reforms on university funding, special needs provision, and the school curriculum while simultaneously demonstrating a fundamental inability to handle a straightforward regulatory matter without ending up in court. It's rather like a driving instructor who keeps crashing into lampposts whilst lecturing about road safety. For Oxford Business College, this vindication comes at an enormous cost. Even if they win substantial damages, the reputational damage and business disruption caused by Phillipson's unlawful actions will take years to recover from. Students had their education disrupted, staff face uncertainty, and the institution's future was thrown into jeopardy, all because an education secretary couldn't be bothered to follow proper procedure before wielding the axe. The political ramifications extend far beyond Phillipson's personal ambitions. This case establishes a precedent that could embolden other institutions to challenge governmental overreach in the education sector. When a High Court judge rules that a cabinet minister's actions were unlawful and compares departmental procedures to Kafka's nightmarish bureaucracy, it sends a message that even education secretaries aren't above the law. What's particularly damning is that this entire mess was entirely avoidable. Had Phillipson simply followed established procedures, conducted a proper investigation, and provided Oxford Business College with a fair opportunity to respond to the allegations, she could have achieved the same regulatory objectives without facing a multi-million-pound lawsuit and a judicial humiliation that will follow her for the rest of her political career. The lesson here is brutally simple. In British democracy, process matters. Justice isn't just about reaching the right conclusion. It's about reaching it through the right methods. Phillipson forgot that fundamental principle, and now she's paying the price in the most public way possible. The High Court has reminded her, and indeed the entire government, that we still live in a country where the rule of law matters, even when it's inconvenient for politicians with newspaper headlines to chase. So there you have it, a masterclass in how not to govern, delivered courtesy of our very own education secretary. Phillipson's legal nightmare serves as a stark reminder that in politics, as in education, homework matters, and she clearly didn't do Hayes. Make sure you subscribe to UK Connors for more insight into the political chaos that continues to define modern British governance. Because trust me, if this government's track record is anything to go by, there's plenty more where this came from.